Hello, this is Patrick Little, and today I'm reading with commentary Sir Archibald Ramsay's The Nameless War, published in 1952. Please enjoy, this is full of red pills. Note: to the classic Academia reprint. Readers of this book will find reference therein to an individual named Tyler Kent, a document named the Red Book, and the author's imprisonment under Regulation 18B. All three of these topics deserve a fuller explanation. Tyler Kent was an American diplomat based in London in 1939 to 1940, accused and imprisoned for taking copies of secret documents home and then allegedly passing them to a white Russian, parenthetical anti-communist, and parenthetical, by the name of Anna Valkov. The latter allegedly passed some of these documents on to German contacts. Kent was also a friend of Archibald Ramsay, and the latter gave Kent a copy of his Right Club membership list, called the Red Book, to keep safe. The Right Club, as Ramsay explains in the book, was his lobby within the Conservative Party which aimed at reducing Jewish influence within the party. The Red Book was Ramsay's only connection with Kent, and it served as a convenient but transparent reason to ensure his detention without trial under the notorious Regulation 18B in wartime Britain. Just a side note here, I want you to realize that Regulation 18B is the equivalent of the Patriot Act, and it was used to throw anyone who questioned Jewish power in prison in Britain. We know that the Patriot Act was written by Jews in Israel, and it was enforced with passage to the Congress, making sure nobody spoke out against it, by the dual citizen of Israel, Michael Chertoff, the Jew director of Homeland Security. He was one of the authors of that. So this is not the first time the Patriot Act or something like it was used to silence dissent against Jewish tyranny, and God bless Sir Archibald Ramsay for having tried to stop the Jewish war of aggression in Central Europe and eventually in the world, designed to destroy those enemies of the Jewish international banking system. Introduction. Here is a story that people have said would never be written in our time, the true history of events leading up to the Second World War, told by one who enjoyed the friendship and confidence of Mr. Neville Chamberlain during the critical months between Munich and September 1939. Munich, of course, is referring to the conference that was had between Hitler and Chamberlain in Munich to secure the peaceful resolution to the Czechoslovakian question, where the Red Comintern had secured forward air bases in Czechoslovakia, which was a Jewish supremacist-backed state, to launch an invasion of Germany with. You remember, as early as 1919, 1920, the Red Armies had attempted to break in and relieve communist rebellions and communist takeovers of German provinces such as Bavaria, where they had overthrown the existing indigenous order and instituted Jewish communism. Bolshevism was now going to try and come through Czechoslovakia. The one in Poland was where the Poles actually fought and stopped the Jew Bolsheviks and their slave army of communists that was trying to go through Poland to relieve Luxembourg and other Jews that had taken power in certain parts of Germany and installed communism. So Hitler saw the writing on the wall and had stopped the use of Czechoslovakia as a Jewish forward operating base against the Free State of Germany, which was operating without Jewish central banking. Anyhow, the next paragraph. There has long been an unofficial ban on books dealing with what Captain Ramsay calls the Nameless War, the conflict which has been waged from behind the political scene for centuries, which is still being waged, and of which very few are aware. The publishers of the Nameless War believe this latest exposure will do more than any previous attempt to break the conspiracy of silence. The present work, with much additional evidence and a fuller historical background, is the outcome of the personal experiences of a public figure who in the course of duty has discovered at first hand the existence of a centuries-old conspiracy against Britain, Europe, and the whole of Christendom. The Nameless War reveals an unsuspected link between all the major revolutions in Europe, from King Charles I's time to the abortive attempt against Spain in 1936. One source of inspiration, design, and supply is shown to be common to all of them. These revolutions and the World War of 1939 are seen to be integral parts of one and the same master plan. After a brief review of the forces behind the declaration of war and the worldwide arrests of many who endeavored to oppose them, the author describes the autonomy of the revolutionary international machine, the machine which today continues the plan for supranational world power, the age-old messianic dream of international Jewry. It is the author's belief that the machine would break down without the support of its unwilling Jews and unsuspecting Gentiles, and he puts forward suggestions for detaching these elements. This is similar to Henry Ford. If you've read The International Jew, Henry Ford also thought that you could convince Jews to stop supporting the Jewish elite and international Jewry and this international revolutionary machine he talks about. Unfortunately, time has proven that this is very hard to do, and the best thing to do is focus on trying to wake up the Goyim. And if any Jews want to speak out against Jewish tyranny in the process, that's a welcome secondary effect. Christians say Captain Ramsay, a Christian gentleman of unflagging courage, believed that the war with Germany was not conceived in the interests of Britain and could lead only to the extension of communist and Jewish power. Because he warned his fellow countrymen of the forces at work, he was put in prison without a trial for over 4 years, for reasons so preposterous that those who framed them dared not submit them to a court of law. And that is an excerpt from Truth. That's a publication. Here's an excerpt from a periodical called Cross and Flag. For years, Captain Ramsay had been a member of the British Parliament. His book is an analysis of the Jewish Zionist war against Christian civilization. And here is a Jewish excerpt, one of them from the Jewish Chronicle. And it says, "There is no limit to the depths of human depravity. Captain Mal Ramsay seems to have made a very determined attempt to plumb those depths." So they're kind of poking fun at him, saying, oh my god, he's a conspiracy theorist and he's depraved. And the next Jewish one, a communist rag called the Daily Worker, says, "The publication of such a book at this time underlines the urgent need for the law to be reformed so as to make it a crime to preach racial hatred or publish libels on groups in the community." Wow, that's from like before 1952. This is insane. The Jews always use the same talking points, eh? Pointing out the truth is hatred. And so the book is now dedicated to the memory of those patriots who in 1215 at Runnymede signed Magna Carta, and those who in 1320 at Abrath signed the Declaration of Independence. This book is dedicated. 27th July, 1952. The Prologue. Edward I banished the Jews from England for many grave offenses endangering the welfare of his realm and lieges, which were to a great extent indicated in the Statutes of Jewry. And it directs you to Appendix 3. So let's check out Appendix 3, the Statutes of Jewry. Appendix 3, the Statutes of the Realm. Lettres de la Jewry, 1275. Back then, the Normans had come in and they were French-speaking and they were the rulers of England. From the Statutes of the Realm, Volume 1, page 221. It begins with, "The Statutes of Jewry. Usury, forbidden to the Jews. Forasmuch as the king hath seen that drivers evil and the disheartening of good men of his land have happened by the usuries which the Jews have made in time past, and that divers sin have followed thereupon, albeit that he and his ancestors have received benefit from the Jewish people in all times past. Nevertheless, for the honor of God and the common benefit of the people, the king hath ordained and established that from henceforth no Jew shall lend anything at usury, either upon land or upon rent or upon other thing." The next section, Distress for Jews. "And that the distress for debts due unto Jews from henceforth shall not be so grievous, but that the moiety of lands and chattels of the Christians shall remain for their maintenance, and that no distress shall be made for a Jewry debt upon the heir of a debtor named in the Jew's deed, nor upon any other person holding the land that was the debtor's before, that the debt be put in suit and allowed in court." Next section, Valuing lands taken for a Jew's debt. And if the sheriff or other bailiff by the king's command hath to give seisin possession to a Jew, be it one or more, for their debt, the chattels shall be valued by the oaths of good men, and be delivered to the Jew or Jews or their proxy to the amount of the debt. And if their chattels be not sufficient, their lands shall be extended by the same oath before the delivery of seisin or possession to the Jew or Jews, to each in his due proportion, so that if it be certainly known that the debt is quit, and the Christian shall have his land again, saving always to the Christians the moiety one of two equal parts, his land and chattels, for maintenance as foresaid, and the chief mansion. Warranty to Jews is the next section. And if it movably hereafter be found in possession of a Jew, and any man shall sue him, the Jew shall be allowed his warranty if he may have it. And if not, let him answer therefore, so that he be not therein otherwise privileged than a Christian. Abode of a Jew is the next section. And that all Jews shall dwell in the king's own cities and boroughs, wherein all chests of the chirographs of Jews are wont to be. Their badge is the next section. And each Jew, after he shall be 7 years old, shall wear a badge on his outer garment, that is to say, in the form of 2 tables, joined of yellow felt, of the length of 6 inches, and the breadth of 3 inches. Their tax is the next section. And that each one, after he shall be 12 years old, pay 3 pence yearly at Easter of tax to the king, whose bondman he is. And this shall hold place as well for a woman as for a man. Next section is conveyance of land, etc., by Jews. And that no Jew shall have the power to enforce, or that means take possession of, another, whether Jew or Christian, of houses, rents, or tenements, that he now hath, nor alien in any other manner, nor to make acquittance to any Christian of his debt without the special license of the king, until the king shall have otherwise ordained therein. Next section is called Privileges of the Jews. And forasmuch as it is the will and sufferance of the Holy Church that they may live and be preserved, the king taketh them under his protection, and granteth them his peace, and willeth that they be safely preserved and defended by his sheriffs and other bailiffs and his liegemen, and commandeth that none shall do them harm or damage or wrong in their bodies or in their goods, more movable or immovable, and that they shall neither plead nor be impleaded in any court, nor be challenged or troubled in any court, except of the king whose bondsmen they are, and that none shall owe obedience or services or rent except to the king or his bailiffs in his name, unless it be for their dwelling which they now hold by paying rent, saving the right of Holy Church. And the next section is intercourse between Jews and Christians. And the king granteth until them that they may gain their living by lawful merchandise and their labor, and that they may have intercourse with Christians in order to carry on lawful trade by selling or buying. But that no Christian for this cause or any other shall dwell among them, and the king willeth that they shall not by reason of their merchandise be put to lot and suit, other words, distributed, nor in their taxes with the men of the cities and boroughs where they abide, for that they are taxable to the king and as his bondmen, and to none other but the king. Next section is holding houses and farms, etc. Moreover, the king granteth unto them that they may buy homes and castleages in the city and boroughs where they abide, so that they hold them in chief of the king, saying unto the lords of the fee their services due and to custom, and that they may take and buy farms or land for the term of 10 years or less without taking homages and fealties or such sort of obedience from Christians, and without having advowsons of church, and that they may be able to gain their living in the world if they have not the means of trading or cannot labor. And this license to take land to farm shall endure to them for 15 years from this time forward. Note, the Parliament which passed this statute included representatives of the Commons, and this was probably the first statute in the enactment of which the Commons had any part. It is significant that the first evidence of the feelings and wishes of the commoners should have expressed itself in such a form as in these statutes of Jewry, in face of the fact clearly evident in the script that the kings owed much to Jewish activities, having demanded monies from the Jews regularly and permitted them in turn to recoup themselves from the people. In other words, the elites had always been able to tax the Jews who were fleecing the population, and it was only after the Magna Carta, or when the people or the commoners had a say through the House of Commons, that the privileges of the Jews began and the abuses of the Jews began to be restricted by the people. God bless the British for having created the Magna Carta, and that was Appendix 3, the Statutes of the Realm. So going back to the reading of, before the reading of that appendix, Edward I banished the Jews from England for many grave offences endangering the welfare of his realm and lieges, which were to a great extent indicated in the Statutes of Jewry enacted by his Parliament in 1290, the commoners playing a prominent part. In other words, it's clear that once through the Magna Carta, the common people and some of the lesser aristocracy got to have a say in government, they immediately imposed restrictions on the Jews. So this led to the Jews' expulsion because they always break the law. They think they're above the law. Moving on, the King of France very shortly followed suit, as did other rulers in Christian Europe. So grave did the situation for the Jews in Europe become that an urgent appeal for help and advice was addressed by them to the Sanhedrin, which is like the Jewish World Court. It's kind of like their cabal, like the Jewish World Congress today. Was addressed by them to the Sanhedrin, then located in Constantinople. This appeal was sent over the signature of Chamor, rabbi of Arles in Provence, on the 13th January 1489. The reply came in November 1489, which was issued over the signature of VSS VFF, Prince of the Jews. It advised the Jews of Europe to adopt the tactics of the Trojan horse, to make their sons Christian priests, lawyers, doctors, etc., and work to destroy the Christian structure from within. So this is the earliest version of the Frankfurt School that I have on record. They did it long before the Frankfurt School, so this is in the 15th century. The Jews were instructed to subvert their host societies by the seat of world Jewish power then at Constantinople. The first notable repercussion to this advice occurred in Spain in the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella. Many Jews were by then enrolled as Christians, but remaining secretly Jews were working to destroy the church in Spain. So grave became the menace finally that the Inquisition was instituted in an endeavor to cleanse the country from these conspirators. Once again, the Jews were compelled to commence an exodus from yet another country whose hospitality they had abused. So there's a pattern here. They're getting kicked out one place after the other because they keep on doing the same shit because they think they're better than everyone else, and because they refuse to integrate, and because they think we're all their slaves. Trekking eastwards, the Jews joined other Jewish communities in Western Europe. Considerable numbers flowed on to Holland and Switzerland. From now on, these two countries were to become active centers of Jewish intrigue. Jewry, however, has always needed a powerful seafaring nation to which to attach itself, and you notice the seat of world Jewish power, the Prince of the Jews, was at Byzantium, which had the most powerful navy before the Jews of the Sanhedrin and just the Jews of Constantinople opened the gates to the invading Ottomans. When they had a deal worked out with them that they get to be middlemen and make money off transactions and just be middlemen and tax collectors for the invading Ottomans if they opened the doors in the night to the invading Ottomans. And that was the fall of Byzantium. Eastern Rome was lost because of Jews. Anyhow, Great Britain, newly united under James I, was a rising naval power which was already beginning to sway the four corners of the discovered world. And this was right after the fall of Constantinople, which the Jews gave to the Ottomans. Here also there existed a wonderful field for disruptive criticism. Although it was a Christian kingdom, yet it was one most sharply divided between Protestant and Catholic. A campaign for exploiting this division and fanning hatreds between the Christian communities was soon in process of organization. How well the Jews succeeded in this campaign in Britain may be judged from the fact that one of the earliest acts of their creature and hireling, Oliver Cromwell, after executing the king according to plan, was to allow the Jews free access to England once more. Chapter 1. The British Revolution. It was fated that England should be the first in a series of revolutions which is not yet finished, is the end quote. With these cryptic words, Isaac Disraeli, father of Benjamin, Earl of Beaconsfield, commenced his two-volume Life of Charles I, published in 1851. Benjamin Disraeli was the first ethnic Jew who achieved high governmental status. He was a prime minister in the 19th century of Britain. This was after 200 years of Britain's enslavement by the Jew Bank of England. He was a lot like Chomsky. He pretended at times to be critical of Jewish power, but really he just thought there was a best method of going about having Jewish power. And so he gives the beginnings of red pills in his book that he wrote on the history of Charles I, published in 1851. And we're going to go into this more here. Moving on. With these cryptic words, Isaac Disraeli, father of Benjamin, Earl of Beaconsfield, commenced his two-volume Life of Charles I, published in 1851. A work of astonishing detail and insight, much information for which, he states, was obtained from the records of one Melchior de Salem, French envoy in England during that period. The scene opens with distant glimpses of the British kingdom based upon Christianity in its own ancient traditions. These sanctions binding monarchy, church, state, nobles, and the people in one solemn bond on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ominous rumblings of Calvinism. And we're going to find out shortly, Calvin's an ethnic Jew, a crypto-Jew, trying to sow division in Europe, and targeted specifically Britain. Moving on. Calvin, who came to Geneva from France, where his name was spelt Cowan, a French effort to spell Cohen, organized great numbers of revolutionary orators, not a few of whom were inflicted upon England and Scotland. This is the first footnote of Chapter 1, footnote number 2. At a B'nai Brit meeting in Paris, reported in Catholic Gazette in February 1936, he was claimed to be of Jewish extraction. So the B'nai Brit, the founders of the ADL, claimed that Cowan or Calvin was a Jew. So this is straight from one of the most powerful Jewish organizations' mouths in a meeting behind closed doors. So Calvin was almost certainly an ethnic Jew, a crypto-Jew. And if you remember the proclamation from the Prince of the Jews at Byzantium in the 15th century, it is the duty of all Jews to subvert their host nations, to infiltrate churches and sow division so that the Jews may take control of the societies and kill the aristocracies that hadn't given the Jews free reign over the people to enslave them, as they had in Egypt and other places in the past. Calvin, who came to Geneva from France where his name was spelt Cowan, possibly a French effort to spell Cohen, organized a great number of revolutionary orators, not a few of whom were inflicted upon England and Scotland. Thus was laid the groundwork for revolution under a cloak of religious fervor. God, I just want to start reading E. Michael Jones now, but I'll skip that for now. On both sides of the Tweed, these demagogues contracted all religion into rigid observance of the Sabbath. And you have to remember, if you read the protocols, if you read any of the writings from Professor Dr. Kevin MacDonald, this is how the Jews do. They figure out a way to get in institutions and subvert them and cause infighting and create kind of like patriarchal cults of personality like Boaz, and I'd say Boaz and Freud in the 19th and 20th centuries were the equivalent of Calvin then in the 16th century. This is designed to infiltrate and destroy institutions. In the former case, academia, and the institutions of the West that were scholarly and scientific, and in the latter case here, he's referring, of course, to Protestant churches. Luther had made it very clear, he who founded Protestant Christianity, as well as many of the popes, almost every pope before hymn in Catholicism laid out that Jews will try to subvert the church. And so once Luther was gone from the scene, this is the Jews' attempt to subvert, and divide and conquer, quite successfully, I might add, Protestantism and hijack it. So, this high psychological intensity preaching and demagoguery used to incite revolution, much like Bolshevism, Leveillerism, the Reign of Terror in France, etc. This is all the same thing. Jewish psychological identity and Jews hiding the fact that they're ethnic Jews, pretending to be something they're not, whether they're pretending to be Bolsheviks, pretending to be egalitarians, pretending to be libertines in France. The same thing continues throughout history. Jews disguise their own terrorist tyrannical interests of enslavement of the Goyim under the guise of universal good and universal revolution, usually guised in egalitarianism. So we're moving on here. I'm sorry if I'm making so much commentary. I'm going to cut down on the commentary. On both sides of the Tweed, these demagogues contracted all religion into a rigid observance of the Sabbath. To use the words of Isaac Disraeli, quote, "The nation was artificially divided into Sabbatarians and Sabbath breakers. Calvin," states Disraeli, "deemed the Sabbath to be a Jewish ordinance limited to the sacred people." So this is him inserting Judaism into Protestant Christianity. He goes on to say that when these Calvinists held the country in their power, quote, "it seemed that religion chiefly consisted of Sabbatarian rigors, and that a British Senate had been transformed into a company of Hebrew rabbins. In other words, they turned the governmental structure into like a Jewish oligarchy, and the people in the government were acting like the Jews do now with their Shabbat enforcers on Saturdays in Israel." And later, in quote, "in 1650, after the execution of the king, an act was passed inflicting penalties for a breach of the Sabbath," end quote. Buckingham, Strafford, and Laud are the three chief figures round the king in these early stages, men on whose loyalty to himself, the nation, and the ancient tradition Charles can rely. So these were kind of like his right-hand men. And you're going to see how the men around the king were divided and conquered from the king and subverted or imprisoned or killed as a way of weakening the king. So Jewish divide and conquer. Buckingham, the trusted friend of King James I and of those who had saved his life at the time of the Gowrie conspiracy of ominous Kabbalistic associations, was assassinated in the early years of King Charles's reign under mysterious circumstances. Strafford, who had been in his early days inclined to follow the opposite faction, later left them and became a staunch and devoted adherent to the king. This opposition faction became steadily more hostile towards Charles, and Charles being the King of England who wanted to keep the Jews out. And by the time they were led by Pym and decided to impeach Strafford. So you see, they go after the people who were helping to keep the king in power, to keep the Jews out. Quote, "The king," writes Disraeli, quote, "regarded this faction as his enemies, and he states that the head of this faction was the Earl of Bedford. Walsh, the eminent Catholic historian, states that a Jew wine merchant named Roussel was the founder of this family in Tudor times." So in other words, crypto-Jews are leading this thing to take down the indigenous elite that was protecting the peasants and the lower nobles from Jewish exploitation. For 300 years, the kings of England had enforced the ban of Jews from England. And you're going to see how a crypto-Jew did his bit to undermine, while Cromwell came funded by Jew bankers and Jew synagogues in Holland, identified earlier in the book along with Switzerland as Jewish strongholds for the export of intrigue and subversion. This is heavy stuff, I know, but this is very condensed. I have to unpack a lot of this for you. So basically, this Roussel family led the opposition, and they were crypto-Jews. Wine merchants. Had evaded ejection and expulsion from Great Britain or England via crypsis, as Dr. Kevin MacDonald talks about often in his books, how the Jews use crypsis to infiltrate closed societies and then open them up to Jewish exploitation. With the impeachment and execution of Strafford, the powers behind the rising Calvinist or Cohenist I like that, Cohenist instead of Calvinist, conspiracy began to reveal themselves and their focus, the City of London. This, of course, became the International Jewelry's headquarters of private central banking for quite some time, and arguably is still to this day. Uh, at the time, there suddenly began to appear from the city, and that's referring to the City of London, armed mobs of so-called operatives, the medieval equivalent for workers, no doubt. So he's making an allusion to the parallel between this levelers' revolution and operatives and the Bolshevik revolution and the proletariat or workers. Let me quote Disraeli. Quote, "They were said to amount to 10,000 with warlike weapons. It was a militia for insurgency at all seasons, and might be depended upon for any work of destruction at the cheapest rate. As these sallied forth with daggers and bludgeons from the city, the inference is obvious that this train of explosion might have been long laid." So, in other words, the Jews had been working to stoke up people behind the scenes, just as the Jews had been trying to incite the proletariat, so to say, in Bolshevik Russia for 20, 30 years via means of social democracy and things like that, towards the aim of a Bolshevist revolution where they'd be useful idiots for the killing of the people that had been trying to limit Jewish exploitation of the common man. In other words, he's saying they were long prepared this revolution, and it was at least 10,000 strong, and they were extremely violent. You know, writ Antifa, writ any communist or Bolshevik revolution in the 20th century in Europe, writ the Bauernaufstand of 1848, that the German nobles were actually able to subdue by giving rights to the workers and the farmers, etc., etc., and writ the Jacobins and such, or Jacobites in France during the Reign of Terror. Useful idiots being violent, doing the bidding of the Jews and destroying the existing power structure that limited Jewish power. So this book is intended for people that already know history, so I'm going to have to fill in some blanks for you here. My apologies. If I get verbose, that's my style. Moving on. It must indeed, and it must indeed, referring to the tracks for this revolution long having been laid by these crypto Jews. And we must recollect here that at this time Strafford was still unexecuted, and civil war in the minds of none but those behind the scenes, who evidently had long since resolved upon and planned it. These armed mobs of workers intimidated all and sundry, included both House of Parliament and the palace at critical moments, exactly on the model employed later by the sacred bands and the Marseille in the French Revolution. So he's drawing parallel to another later Jewish revolution that appeared as a universalist revolution when it was really designed to put Jews in power, which is exactly what happened in England, and exactly what happened in France, and exactly what happened in the Bolshevik revolutions of Europe, including the 1917 revolution in Russia, and later the rest of the Slavic territories in Central Europe. Isaac Disraeli draws again and again startling parallels between this and the French Revolution, notably in his passages on the press, the media, quote, no longer under restraint in the deluge of revolutionary pamphlets and leaflets. Quote, from 1640 to 1660, he writes, quote, about 30,000 appeared to have started up, and he's referring to, of course, these Jewish propaganda pamphlets. And later, quote, the collection of French revolutionary pamphlets now stands by the side of the French tracts of the age of Charles I, as abundant in number and as fierce in passion. So in other words, he's saying that Jews started up a bunch of propaganda. Back then, propaganda was anyone with a printing press or anyone who could scribe out a bunch of pamphlets. And so this was the Jews using the printing press to weaponize propaganda for incitement against the existing order that had limits on Jewish power. And the same thing happened in Britain, as later happened during the Reign of Terror, as commented on by Sir Edmund Burke, in France in the late 18th century. So he goes on, and he's talking about Disraeli. So basically, Sir Archibald Ramsay is filling in the gaps between the citations from the two-volume series that Disraeli wrote in the 19th century about the Jewish subversion of the time, at the time of the Levelers' Revolution of the 1640s, and the parallels to the French Revolution. He goes on, whose hand behind the curtain play the strings, could post up a correct list of 59 commoners, branding them with the odious title of Straffordians or betrayers of their country. So the propagandists, the Jews that had the propaganda rags, were demonizing the people that stood between the Jews and taking control of power. And it goes on. But whose hand indeed? But Disraeli, who knew so much, now discreetly draws a veil over that iron curtain, and it is left to us to complete the revelation. To do so, we must turn to such other works as the Jewish Encyclopedia, Sombart's work, The Jews and Modern Capitalism, and others. So in other words, Disraeli is writing in general about revolutionaries, kind of the way that Ben Shapiro might talk about the left or something. So then Sir Archibald Ramsay is going in Dr. Kevin MacDonald style and filling in the gaps of the who's who and what's really going on, quoting from Jewish sources. So, of course, Disraeli, the ethnically Jewish prime minister of Britain in the 19th century, was writing for the Goyim, not writing for Jews. So Sir Archibald Ramsay, much in the style of Dr. David Duke and Dr. Kevin MacDonald, had to go to the Jewish sources written for Jewish eyes to fill in the blanks so that the Goy might finally realize what was really going on with these revolutions. Cui bono, who was really benefiting, and who was behind it. From the Jewish World Encyclopedia and the Jews and Modern Capitalism, we learn that Cromwell, the chief figure of the revolution, was in close contact with the powerful Jew financiers in Holland, and was in fact paid large sums of money by Mansa ben Israel, whilst Fernandez Carvajal, the so-called Great Jew, as he was called, was the chief contractor of the New Model Army. In The Jews in England, we read, quote, 1643 brought a large contingent of Jews to England. Their rallying point was the house of the Portuguese ambassador de Souza, a Marrano, or a crypto-Jew that had concealed his Jewish ethnicity by embracing ostensibly Catholicism. So, once again, we have a crypto-Jew here being the conduit through which these revolutionary Jews are pouring in. Nothing ever changes with these Jews, unfortunately. Prominent among them was Ferdinand Carrieval, a great financier and army contractor. In January of the previous year, the attempted arrest of the 5 members had set in violent motion the armed gangs of operatives, which is, you gotta remember, that's like the Red Army of the time, already mentioned, from the city of London, that is. Revolutionary pamphlets were broadcasted on this occasion, as Disraeli tells us, quote, bearing the ominous insurrectionary cry of, "To your tents, O Israel," end quote. Jesus Christ. This reminds me a lot of Dr. Kevin MacDonald's Culture of Critique. Anyhow, shortly after this, the king and the royal family left the palace of Whitehall. The 5 members, with armed mobs and banners accompanying them, were given a triumphal return to Westminster. This can be considered a lot like the Freikorps of Germany, the veterans of World War I stopping the Jews from seizing power as communists in Bavaria and other places in Germany. Indigenous resistance to Jewish subversion. The stage was now set for the advent of Carrihal and his Jews and the rise of their creature Cromwell. So the Jews established a revolutionary beachhead, and just as Lenin and Trotsky were welcomed in as heroes, and of course they're coming from Switzerland and New York on a secret train bringing them in to be the heads of the revolution, here the Jewish beachhead was established with a 10,000 man strong army led and funneled in by crypto Jews, laying out the red carpet for the arrival of their chief orator and their chief leader, the Shabbos Goy, Oliver Cromwell, who's basically going to now be the Goyish face of the Jewish takeover of Britain. The scene now changes. So that left off talking about 1643. The scene now changes. The Civil War has taken its course. The year is 1647. Naseby has been won and lost. The king is virtually a prisoner, while treated as an honored guest at Hombley House. According to a letter published in plain English on the 3rd September 1921. And here's a footnote, footnote number 3, and it's called A Weekly Review published by North British Publishing Company and also edited by the late Alfred Douglas. That's the source of this letter. On the 3rd September 1921, quote, the learned elders have been in existence for much longer period than any they have perhaps than any have perhaps suspected. My friend, Mr. L.D. van Valkert of Amsterdam, has recently sent me a letter containing 2 extracts from the synagogue at Mulheim. So basically, you'll notice the parallel here. At first, the czars were also treated nicely, and then they were eventually moved to a basement, where they were then executed between the basement and the cave, or in the yard between the basement and the cave, where their bodies were dumped into Jewish ritual murder. So it's the same thing here. They come for the king's head, but at first they're kind of making it look like he's being treated well. So referring then to the letters from the synagogues at Mulheim, the correspondence to the Jews leading the revolution and the Shabbos Goyim leading the revolution in Britain, 1647. The volume in which they are contained was lost at some period during the Napoleonic Wars and has recently come into Mr. von Falkert's possession. So these letters between the Jews and their Shabbos Goyim and crypto Jews in England was uncovered in 1921 again. It was written in German and contains extracts of letters sent and received by the authorities of the Mulheim synagogue. The first entry he sends me is of a letter received. 16th June, 1647, from Oliver Cromwell, by Ebenezer Pratt. Okay. In return for financial support, will advocate admission of Jews to England. This, however, impossible while Charles living. So these are truncated messages, you'll notice. They're leaving out some helper verbs and stuff. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which do not at present exist. Therefore advise that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. He's saying, basically, let's arrange for it to look like someone's offering to help King Charles escape, and then use the attempted escape as an excuse to execute King Charles. This is very fucking Jewish, pardon my French. My God, these are some clever bastards. And then the 12th of July, 1647, less than a month later, to Oliver Cromwell by E. Pratt, and of course that's coming from Ebenezer in Holland, will grant financial aid as soon as Charles removed and Jews admitted. Assassination too dangerous. Charles shall be given opportunity to escape. His recapture will make trial and execution possible. The support will be liberal, but useless to discuss terms until trial commences. End quote. So, in other words, yes, plan to entrap King Charles into an excuse to execute him by giving him an escape attempt. Approved. And your money's going to come to secure power in Britain as soon as you secure the open admittance of Jews into the country. So this was quid pro quo. Do whatever the Jews want, and then they'll give you the power to rule over the Goyim as a Shabbos Goy. With this information now at our disposal, the subsequent moves on the part of the regicides now stand out with new clearness. Regicides are people that commit murder against kings and royalty. Cromwell himself, according to Disraeli, unknown even to General-in-Chief Fairfax, descended upon Hombley House with 500 picked revolutionary troopers and seized the king. According to Disraeli, quote, the plan was arranged on May 30th at a secret meeting held at Cromwell's house, though later Cromwell pretended that it was without his concurrence, end quote. So basically this was planned at Cromwell's house, but he's going to later deny any connection to it. This move coincided with a sudden development in the army, the rise of the, quote, levelers and, quote, rationalists. Their doctrines were those of the French revolutionaries. In fact, what we know today as communism. These were the regicides, who 4 times purged Parliament till there was left finally 50 members, communists like themselves, known later as the Rump. So this is exactly like the rototilling of the ruling elite that happened in France. They wave after wave, they killed aristocrats until finally they killed their own useful idiots that had brought in the Jews to power, until finally, before Napoleon comes on the scenes, only Jews had power during the Reign of Terror. This is exactly like the 20 years leading up to Russians starting to then begin purging Jews from the head of the Soviet Union, and Russian nationalism reemerged as Jewish overrepresentation was cut down on, and Jewish internationalists were then purged or executed in the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 1950s, and arguably starting in the 1930s. So this is the same pattern, the same exact damn pattern. To return to the letter from Mulheim Synagogue of the 12th June 1647, and its cunning suggestion that attempted escape should be used as a pretext for execution, and of course they're referring to an execution of the king, who would not let the Jews back into England after 300 years of keeping his people safe from the presence of Jews, although there were some crypto-Jews that he didn't realize were still there. Just such an event took place on 12th November of that year. Hollis and Lidlove consider that the flight as a stratagem of Cromwell's. Isaac Disraeli states, quote, "Contemporary historians have decided that the king, from the day of his deportation from Humbly to his escape to the Isle of Wight, was throughout the dupe of Cromwell." So in other words, this whole time the king is being led on an escape route, like an underground railroad to freedom. The whole time he's being led by servants of the Jews that were just, putting on a show escape so that they could then execute King Charles without a trial. That the trial would now be not for the crime of having kept Jews out of the country, but the crime of having tried to escape the revolutionary government. Very clever. Very friggin' clever. Remember, Goyim who know about Jewish power and speak about it, remember, entrapment is a constant factor. If they can't get you on thought crime, they'll try and entrap you with some other sort of crime. I wonder if this episode of King Charles being entrapped by controlled opposition with this escape attempt was in any way an inspiration for Orwell's description of the entrapment by people who fell in behind Emmanuel Goldstein. Moving on. Little more remains to be said. Cromwell had carried out the orders from the synagogue, and now it only remained to stage the mock trial. Maneuvering for position continued for some time, and it became apparent that the House of Commons, even in their partially purged condition, were in favor of coming to an agreement with the king. On 5th December 1648, the House sat all night and finally carried the question, quote, that the king's concessions were satisfactory to a settlement, end quote. They didn't purge enough people loyal to England from the government, from the parliament, so there's going to have to be another night of the long knives to kill off the people that aren't full-blown servants of the Jews. And that's about to be mentioned here. Should such an agreement have been reached, of course, Cromwell would not have received the large sums of money which he was hoping to get from the Jews. He struck again. On the night of December the 6th, Colonel Pride, on his instructions, carried out the last and most famous purge of the House of Commons, known as Pride's Purge. On 4th January, the communist remnant of 50 members, the Rump, invested themselves with the, quote, the supreme authority, end quote. So in other words, Cromwell and his Jew assassins just kept on killing people that were voting against executing the king until they had a majority. And this communist body that was left after the killing of all the people that were really loyal to England and loyal to the king and loyal to the commoners that wanted to keep the commoners from being exploited by the Jews, wanted to keep the Jews out of the country, they were purged until, of course, the Jews invented their majority, or rather, murdered their way to a majority. And the Shabbos Goyim Cromwell got his money. Unbelievable. Nothing ever changes. If you are not right now, close your eyes. Picture the same thing happening with all of the aristocrats, all of the Christian priests, and all of the Christians that wouldn't embrace communism. Close your damn eyes real quick. Being killed in front of their churches, the churches all being burned down, the Jews raping all of the Christians' wives, 30 to 50 million people killed, the czars being executed on pretense, and it being a ritual Jewish murder. Imagine then, by stealth, the Jew bankers financing the triumphant arrival of Lenin and Trotsky into then the revolutionary former Russian state. If you don't see this as the same exact thing that happened in 1640s England, and the same exact thing that happened during the Reign of Terror in the 1790s, where it is purge after purge after purge, where the government becomes more and more and more Jewish, more and more Zionist, then you're missing the point here, and you need to go back and listen to whatever I've already read. Moving on. On 9th of January, in other words, after the last purge of those people that maintained a pro-English, anti-Jewish majority in the parliament, on 9th January, at a High Court of Justice, in other words, a show trial for the Jews, to try the king was proclaimed. 2/3 of the members were levelers from the army, levelers being, of course, the word for Bolsheviks in 1647. They were called at many times many different things. Anyhow, they're ultra egalitarians, and these people are useful idiots to kill the people that were in leadership prior to the Jews taking of power. Algernon Sidney warned Cromwell, quote, "First, the king can be tried by no court. Second, no man can be tried by this court," end quote. So writes Hugh Ross Williamson in his Charles and Cromwell. And he adds a finishing touch to the effect that, quote, "No English lawyer could be found to draw up the charge, which was eventually entrusted to an accommodating alien, Isaac Deserlaus, a Jew." So, in other words, they couldn't even find an Englishman to be the prosecutor against the king. They had to find some Jew from overseas to be the attorney. Just like they couldn't find an American to be the tyrannical chief of Homeland Security like we had under that Shabbos bastard guy Bush Jr. And they had to bring in a fucking citizen of Israel, yeah, that's right, Michael fucking Chertoff, to oversee the implementation of tyranny in the United States and the destruction of the Bill of Rights. They had to bring in a goddamn foreign Jew. So, they couldn't get an Englishman to try the king because the king hadn't done anything wrong, so they brought in a foreign Jew named Isaac Dorislaus. Moving on here. Needless to say, Isaac Dorislaus was exactly the same sort of alien as Carvajal, which is, of course, the crypto Jew from Portugal, and Manasseh ben Israel and the other financiers who paid the quote-unquote protector his blood money. And, of course, protector being reference to Cromwell, the guy that opened the doors to the Jews to flood back into England for the first time in 300 and something years. England became a great power in the absence of Jewish parasitism and Jewish tyranny, and the Jews wanted to hijack that navy so that they could then use it to subjugate the world, which to some extent was done. Quote, "The English Revolution under Charles I," end quote, writes Isaac Disraeli, quote, "was unlike any preceding one. From the time and event we contemplate in our history the phases of revolution," end quote. There were many more to follow in similar lines, notably in France in 1897. A further important clue to these mysterious happenings fell into Gentile hands in the shape of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In that document, we read this remarkable sentence, quote, "Remember, the French Revolution, the secrets of its preparation are well known to us, for it was entirely the work of our hands," end quote. The elders might have made the passage even fuller and written, quote, "Remember the British and French revolutions, the secrets of which are well known to us, for they were entirely the work of our hands," end quote. The difficult problem of the subjugation of both kingdoms was still, however, unsolved. Scotland was royalist before everything else. She had proclaimed Charles II king. Cromwell's armies marched around Scotland, aided by their Geneva sympathizers, dispensing Judaic barbarity, but Scotland still called Charles II king. This is the heir to the throne of England that was just assassinated by Jews, Charles I. He, moreover, accepted the Presbyterian form of Christianity for Scotland. And slowly but steadily, the feeling in England began to come around to the Scottish point of view. Finally, upon the death of Cromwell, all Britain welcomed the king's restoration to the throne of England. In 1660, Charles II returned, but there was an important difference between the kingdom he fled from as a boy and the one to which he returned as king. The enemies of kingship were entrenched within his kingdom now, and as soon as the stage should be set for renewing their propaganda against the papacy and so dividing once more persons, all of whom considered themselves as part of Christ's church, the next attack would develop. The next attack would aim at placing the control of the finances of both kingdoms in the hands of the Jews, who were now firmly ensconced within. Charles evidently had no consciousness of the Jewish problem or plans, or the menace they held for his peoples. The wisdom and experience of Edward I had become lost in the centuries of segregation from the Jewish virus. A conscientiousness of the danger to the crown in placing his enemies in possession of a weapon of a, quote, popish plot cry he did retain. With James II's secession, the crisis could not be long delayed. The most unscrupulous pamphleting and propaganda was soon in full swing against him, and it is no surprise to find that many of the vilest pamphlets were actually printed in Holland. This country was now quite openly the focus of all disaffected persons, and considerable comings and goings took place during these years. Stories were brought to the king that his own brother-in-law had joined those who plotted against him, but he utterly refused to credit them or take any action till news came that the expedition against himself was actually underway. The chief figure amongst those who deserted James at that crucial juncture was John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. I wonder if that's any relation to the politician that was completely owned by Jews starting during his time when the Rothschilds bought him his first uniform kit for the wars in South Africa, who went on to lead Britain in a brother war against the Germans that were trying to fight against those very same Rothschild central bankers in the European War of Liberation from 1939 to 1945. Anyhow, it is interesting to read in the Jewish Encyclopedia that this Duke, for many years, this is Churchill he's talking about, for many years received no less than £6,000 a year from the Dutch Jew Solomon Medina. Jesus Christ. The real objective of the glorious revolution was achieved a few years later in 1694, when the royal consent was given for the setting up of the Bank of England, the Rothschild private Jew bank that enslaved the people of England. Writ that. And the institution of the national debt. This charter handed over to an anonymous committee the royal prerogative of minting money, converted the basis of wealth to gold, and enabled the international moneylenders to secure their loans on the taxes of the country instead of the doubtful undertaking of some ruler or potentate, which was all the security they could previously obtain. So this is about enslaving a nation to guarantee the debts that the Jews force the nation to take on, whether it's engaging in wars that the Jew bankers want, like the Opium War against China, etc., etc. This is all just a way to enslave the people to the Jews. From that time, economic machinery was set in motion, which ultimately reduced all wealth to the fictitious terms of gold, which the Jews control, and drained away the lifeblood of the land, the real wealth, which was the birthright of the British peoples. And I want you to remember that Jews have a monopoly on gold stores and gold mines, and they go to war to secure new sources of gold when they're discovered, because they need to be able to control the expansion and contraction of gold available to the market so they can use boom and bust things, just the same way as they manipulate interest rates so that they can make money on insider trading with forewarning on changes in interest rates that affect the price of bonds. So also, before the fiat currency and fractional reserve thing the Jews were doing with fiat money, after going off the gold standard, the Jews were doing their booms and busts based off from manipulating the available supply of gold to the market. So this is just the earlier machination of the way that the Federal Reserve works now. And they're talking about, of course, the Bank of England, which ultimately has a lot of ownership in the Federal Reserve because it's all the same international Jewish banking cartels that own our ability to print money, expand the money supply or contract it to create booms or busts or to manipulate interest rates so they can make money on speculation and suck the lifeblood out of the economy while people lose their jobs and their houses. Moving on. The political and economic union of England and Scotland was shortly afterwards forced upon Scotland with wholesale corruption, and in defiance of formal protests from every county and borough. The main objects of the Union were to suppress the royal mint in Scotland and to force upon her, too, responsibility for the quote-unquote national debt. The grip of the moneylender was now complete throughout Britain. The danger was that the members of the new joint parliament would sooner or later, in the spirit of their ancestors, challenge this state of affairs. To provide against this, therefore, the party system was now brought into being, frustrating true national reaction and enabling the wire pullers to divide and rule, using their newly established financial power to ensure that their own men and their own policies should secure the limelight and sufficient support from their newspapers, pamphlets, and banking accounts to carry the day. In other words, the Jews set up something like our two-party system here that came into existence around the time of the first private central bank of the United States that the Jews set up here. They're either going to use the media, which back then was mostly print, as well as bribes, that's the reference with the banking accounts, as well as pamphlets and other propaganda and media attention referred to as the limelight, to control the political process and make sure that no one who dared to speak out against Jewish banking tyranny could ever make it in politics. Gold was soon to become the basis of loans, 10 times the size of the amount deposited. In other words, 100 pounds in gold would be legal security for 1,000 pounds of loan. At 3%, therefore, 100 pounds of gold could earn 30 pounds interest annually with no trouble to the lender than the keeping of a few ledger entries. The owner of 100 pounds of land, however, still must work every hour of daylight in order to make perhaps 4%. The end of the process must only be a matter of time. The moneylenders must become millionaires. Those who own and work the land, the Englishmen and Scotsmen, must be ruined. The process has continued inexorably till now, when it is nearly completed. It has been hypocritically camouflaged by clever propaganda as helping the poor by mulching the rich. It has been, in reality, nothing of the kind. It has been, in the main, the deliberate ruination of the landed classes, the leaders among the Gentiles, and their supplanting by the Jew financiers and their hangers-on. This is exactly what Henry Ford talked about: the destruction of the industry, the destruction of the landowners, the destruction of even small family farmers. This is the goal: complete economic tyranny, so that the Goyim are completely at the mercy of Jews in terms of their financial well-being. And this is why this whole doxing thing and targeting people and deplatforming and cutting off payment processing for Goyim who dare to speak out is so effective, because they've taken complete control of the American economy, the British economy, the German economy. They're strangling anyone who dissents by the neck economically, given what is ultimately the basis for their power, the Jew central banking system, which is nothing more than a Ponzi scheme designed to leave all of the people, the stakeholders in the country, the non-Jews, holding a bag full of nothing but debt.